Hi, my name is Giovanna Scarsoni. I'm the manager of Children and Family Programs here at the ROM, and I have with me Jacques Lavoie and Gail Gibson, two of our greatest ROM learning educators. And we're here to talk to you about what we have at the ROM for school visits and programs for groups who want to come in and have guided lessons about what we have here at the museum. So, you know, we're going to spend some time here. This is our first Google Hangout for learning, and we're looking forward to having more of these. And you can see all of the many programs that we do here through the year. And we'll talk to you about various things. Today we're going to talk to you mostly about how we're tied to curriculum, and especially we have some new curriculum changes for the social studies in elementary, but all of our programs do tie into the curriculum for schools. And so we're going to give you some examples of how we use objects and talk to students about what we have and how that ties into what you need to teach them during the year. So, Jacques, would you like to talk to us about what you have here?
Sure. Thanks, Ravana. Well, being a teacher at the ROM means teaching with primary sources, artifacts, and in front of me there are examples of some of these artifacts that we use for teaching. And learning from objects is not exactly the same thing as learning from other kinds of sources. Now, what happens is that reading an object is a skill, and it's one that actually ties in with critical thinking. So for that reason, learning from object has a lot of benefits for your students. And given that if you're grade 5 or a grade 6 teacher, let's say, and you know that curriculum has changed, and you might be applying those changes this year, or maybe you're delaying doing that until another year, you know that it's going to change your resources the way maybe gives you a chance to teach differently about these topics. When I say topics, I'm thinking, for example, First Nation peoples, early New France, for example, which ties in with Canadian history and so on. What happens is that there are a lot of resources out there, and museums are certainly a very rich resource. And in this case, we're going to take a look at some of the objects that help us to understand a little bit better what happened in history and how people interacted with each other, and how that is so important about Canadian history, because everybody here has helped to shape what we are today. So, if we start with an artifact that actually I'm going to have Giovanna look at this artifact at the same time you're looking at it, and I'm going to ask her to ask me questions about the artifact that will help us to go and figure out what it is and all the layers of information. So I'm going to start by picking up this one here, which, as you can see, can be handled this way. And I'm going to turn it so that you can actually see the inside of this section. Maybe now, Giovanna, you might have some questions that you'd like to ask this object.
All right. Well, I guess I would want to know how it stands up.
Okay.
Does it hang on something?
Mm-hmm.
What would you put inside it? What's it made out of?
Right. Now, do you want me to go over some of the answers to these questions, or you still have more questions
that
are coming to mind? Okay.
I'm sure there are endless questions.
There are endless questions. They can be actually many questions. No, I think it's important also that I have to mention that every artifact are presented so that they help to understand the context from which they're from. So in this case, this would be on a table where students get to handle artifacts from early New France history. So learning about daily life can be done from a simple object like this one. We're talking an object that would be, in this case, more than 300 years old. So something that to us doesn't look too familiar, but would have been very familiar for someone from back then. Now, you've asked what it's made from. Mm-hmm. Right? So in this case, we can say it's made out of iron. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, would iron have been cheap or expensive back then?
I'm guessing expensive.
That's right. Okay. So already there's investment in the production of something like this. Now, is it decorative?
Not too much, a little bit.
A little bit. You can see a bit of a kind of a twisted kind of pattern here, so this would have made it a little bit more complicated to make. Now, the idea is that it does hang like this, okay? So it would be hang in your house. Now, if I give you a clue, it would be something that would be used in the evening. This is something we need. We actually still use this, but in a different way.
Well, I'm guessing it's a lamp.
That's correct. Okay. Now, what would have been the source of fuel at the time? Any
Some
thoughts?
sort of oil.
That's right. Exactly. In this case, probably tallow or animal fats, so lard, basically. So showing that how people are resourceful in using everything they have, and in this case, with wicks that would be coming out from all three corners here, and it would prevent actually any kind of spilling, which is a good thing, right? So, because people have to be worried about fire.
Right.
Since most people's homes were made of wood, you would have to be worried about that. Okay, so this is kind of a familiar type of object, but let's look at this one now. We have a little bit of time, I believe, to cover this one. This one would have been placed on the table with other objects from the Arctic. So we're changing environment. We're talking about a different people also, not the French settlers, but the Inuit. Okay. Now the question.
Can I touch it?
Yes.
Great. So I can tell that it's a stone, nice and heavy. But judging from what we were just looking at, I'm going to guess that it's also a lamp because it's got a nice place in there to put some sort of fuel.
That's right, exactly. So in this case, a design different in shape, material that's different in shape too, but the function is the same. So learning about, again, how resourceful people are, in this case using animal fat, and if you think about the Arctic and the animals that you would hunt for food mainly, but you would also extract the blubber from these animals, which animal comes to mind?
Whales. I don't know.
Well, any fatty,
Fish.
yes, any fatty animals, so whales, of course, and seals and walrus and so on. So
can you tell me then, we've just compared these two lamps, and the students, when they're in and you're showing them these objects, how are they interacting with these objects as a group?
well, at the table you would have a selection of objects, maybe 4 or 5, let's say, and they would work collaboratively because we would have a worksheet that asks them some questions. So drawing their attention to some of the features of the object, figuring out what it is and what it's made of and what people use it for and why this is so significant and important. So together they can exchange some ideas and talk about their thoughts and then debate also, because there might be some different opinions, right, about the objects. So this is all the fun about examining an objects and thinking about what did people use this for and what skills also were involved in the making of this. So because we're talking about objects that are made before the Industrial Revolution, right? So there's no machines here involved.
Right. Yep. So these are from, is it the New France lesson that we've just updated?
That's right. So we would be using these objects to show the new grade 5 curriculum. I mean, if you're a grade 6 teacher and you're teaching the curriculum that talks about First Nations peoples, you might be familiar with an object like this because you teach about the Arctic, you teach about the Inuit. But if you're now teaching early New France and you're trying to see how this can come alive for the students, well, we have objects, authentic objects that can give students a sense about what it would have been for them to live at that time in this place. So it's the idea of also stimulating their imagination, right? About how and empathy for the people and the period and the times of that when these objects were used.
So these are all lamps, I'm guessing.
That's
For
correct.
different cultures and different time periods.
That's correct. So there is a bit of a, it's not a selection of objects that I would necessarily put out for students in the way that it is, but they would be examples of objects that they would examine. Because I wanted to show also that, in this case, humans for a long time have had this relationship with fire and the need for light. And so you have, for example, on this end, an example of a Roman lamp. So this ancient Roman lamp is about 1,800 years old and comes from North Africa. In fact, you can see the burnt part that indicates the source of heat. The wick is not old, but it's there to give a clue. And understanding that in this case, the fuel would connect them to a very different environment, which is olive oil. So that's interesting because here we're talking about maybe whale oil, but here we're talking about olive oil. So we're not using olive oil in Canada, right?
Not so much.
No.
Wow, the salad. Well, that's great. And so you mentioned the new curriculum. What are you doing with the schools that have not necessarily transferred over to the new curriculum?
Well, for the time being, we'll be able to do both. I think for a teacher that's doing the grade 6 topic as it is, First Nations peoples, the program is there, and we do offer it in French. So, nous faisons tous les programmes en français. And for the teacher who's now venturing into the new curriculum in grade 5, well, I hope you think about us because this is an opportunity for you to see artifacts in action with your students interacting with them and learning from these objects and hopefully having fun doing that too.
Thank you, Jacques. So for those of you who've just joined us, we are here at the Royal Ontario Museum. We're doing our first ROM Learning Google Hangout, and so thanks for joining us. And we've just talked to Jacques about some of these objects for our new grade 5 curriculum. And now we have Gail Gibson, another ROM educator, and she will talk to us about some of our early civilizations objects and how we use objects in talking to students about what we have at the museum and learning about the past and how it fits into how we live in the present day.
So, I think so. One of the things we really like to do is to try and show that human beings are human beings, now or then, and that you don't need space aliens to build pyramids or strange creatures to do anything in the past, that we've always got folks pretty much like us. For example, if you were a little kid in ancient Egypt, you probably would have had one of these. Now, you and I might not have been girls, and that's a big difference between modern times and ancient times, but this would be for a little boy, something you'd use every day. What could that be? It's a nice little thing, fits very nicely in your hand, and you can feel it's very warm. That's really nice.
That is nice and smooth.
It is quite stained.
Yes, had a lot of use. A lot of use. How do you think you could use that, your little boy in ancient times?
Well, well, I mean, it's interesting. It's got this reed sticking in the box. So my first question would be what that might be used for, and if you look inside, what can you see? Are there any hints in there?
It's an interesting little piece. And when we put it out on a table in a lab, I have a few other hints. For example, I was a piece of this stuff, which is modern papyrus. But that's what the ancient Egyptians wrote on. And we have two kinds of pens that they used in the old days. This is just a modern, like a modern bamboo pen, same as we use nowadays. But if you were a little kid, you don't get to use that till you're a little bit bigger. And you would just use little bits of papyrus like this. I guess you'd chew the end. It was just the way you liked it. And then when you got to school, the teacher would put a nice bit of ink up here for you. And then you could dip this in water and get some ink. And then try to draw those hieroglyphs and make them really pretty and nice. And when the pen's finished, you just throw it away. It's just a piece of straw, really. So we've got here something that a school kid used every day about 3,300 years ago. So not very new, but a very dear thing and something that I think connects us with the past in a really intimate way. Now we can also connect with the past in other ways. Sticking with Egypt for a minute, this is one of my very favorite artifacts. Quite heavy. Do you want to give that in the field? Try not to kill Jacques with it.
I'll try.
Yeah. Very often children think this is a weapon.
Great.
This is for the new grade 4 curriculum. It used to be the grade 5 curriculum of ancient and medieval civilizations. This would be for the ancient part of it. And this is very like something you would use today. And in fact, you might see something very like this up at Pioneer Village when you're studying early Canada. So an ordinary, well, not so ordinary anymore thing, and it goes with something else. Now the other artifact has to have help. We wear gloves when we use some of our artifacts at the ROM, because some things are very delicate. It's hard sometimes to believe that these are all the real thing. These aren't replicas. They're not modern pieces that have been made to look like the ancient one. This really is a chisel from about 4,000 years ago. And we use it with this. And that's how you build a pyramid. That's how you build a beautiful ancient temple. You don't need space aliens. All you need is skillful people and lots of ordinary tools. Now, with little kids, sometimes it takes them a while to figure out what these things are. And that, as Jacques says, is one of the nice things. It's object-based learning. It's inquiry method. And what I like is that the 4 children usually around a table, and they're discussing it. And I like to hear them question one another. And I always say, sometimes one person has half the right answer, and somebody else has the other half. So it's very nice, this collaboration in learning and in looking at things. Kind of media literacy as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. And so you've mentioned that these are artifacts from that time in history. So what is the reaction you often get from the kids?
It's very hard for children to believe they're real. And kids will often say, oh, but it's not real. I say, yes, 2,000 years old. Oh yeah, but it's not real. And it's, even the teachers sometimes will say, oh, well, they're all reproductions, aren't they? No, they're not. Like, for example, this is another really lovely thing. I'll hold it up like this first so our viewers can see it. This is a really nice piece. This is about 2,700 years old, so much newer than the ancient Egyptian things. This is from your home country. This is Italian. This is from Etruria. And I'll give you a glove so that you can try it. I'll put it in the case. Ancient metal needs to have gloves because we can damage it with the oil, the acid, and the salt on our fingertips. It's nice for the children to learn how to handle different materials and to handle them carefully.
That's really impressive.
So there you are back in ancient Italy, 2,700 years ago. What are you going to do with that?
It looks like asparagus.
The handle has a piece of asparagus, which is kind of nice.
Great.
Do you think it's maybe for cooking?
You know, I could see how that could be, but it looks somewhat like something you might have like this.
That's exactly what it is. That's an ancient Roman mirror.
Yeah.
And
but it's not so shiny.
No. And very often children say, where would the glass be, or has the glass broken? And the glass hasn't broken on this kind of mirror. They couldn't make a mirrored surface with glass in those days, so it would just be polished up. So one of the differences between now and then would be your view of yourself, which is something we're very interested in schools today, so that when I'm looking at myself in a mirror like this, I don't see myself as clearly as I do now. I don't see all the imperfections. I don't see all the wrinkles. And I look maybe a little golden in the glow of a bronze mirror. But this, cheap or expensive?
I would guess expensive.
Very expensive. So this is a really upper class item. And so the really rich people, they have a mirror of silver. They can see themselves in that. But you've got to be pretty wealthy to own this. So if you're an ordinary person, how do you know what you look like? How do you get your self-image? How do you know, am I pretty? Am I growing up? Am I handsome? What do I look like? Do I look like my dad? How can a little kid learn that sort of thing in ancient times if he's not rich? How could you?
Water.
Water, yeah.
There's We're going to show you a story about the girl who looked herself into water. That's one of the stories that I teach about the how to show history. The story about the girl who lost her face.
Ah, oh my, that's dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
That's a nice thing with the children, and when they come in, we can do, sometimes we take students on a tour of the galleries and look at 2 or 3, or usually 2 or 3, sometimes 4 galleries in one day, so they might learn or tell us that Haudenosaunee story, and maybe remind us of the story of Narcissus from ancient Greece, and maybe Alice through the Looking Glass. There's all kinds of mirror stories that we can look at as we go through the gallery. The children know so many of these stories. Very often they surprise us with what they think of and the connections they make. That's what makes being here at the museum very exciting, because the children are making all the connections.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So these are objects that get taken out in lab lessons in the classrooms.
Yes.
And then you also bring children around to the galleries. When we have a lab lesson, is that always paired with the gallery, or are they separate?
Well, sometimes the experience could be all in the gallery. So at that point, they could be visiting collections that are related to the topic that they're studying. And it would be done in a way that would be teacher-led. The teacher would be doing the same thing with the artifacts that are on display, by questioning, developing critical thinking, connecting stories that are significant and add meaning to the study of the culture. And in some instances, like for example, for early Canada, First Peoples, Egypt, and Rome, we have teaching collections, which means that the students will have access to handle these objects in the context of what we call a lab. That looks a bit like a classroom in terms of its size, but it's a special classroom because it's
well, it's got authentic artifacts.
That's
so
right.
that's, I mean, the ultimate primary source. Right?
That's right.
How often can you get to hold a 2,700-year-old mirror, or some of these objects? So that's great. So they get the unique experience of handling the objects and talking to you about the history and how the objects fit into that story. And they're using their critical thinking skills, and they're talking to each other and using new words and vocabulary.
Yes.
So it sounds great to me, because they're learning about a time in history or a culture or an economy or a way of cultures interacting,
Right.
but they're also using these skills that the students just need to develop at the time anyway, that are not necessarily tied directly to a particular lesson in history, but how they look at objects and look at the world around them and analyze what they're learning.
One of the nice things about coming to the ROM Live is that the first question we always ask a teacher is, what have you been studying, and what are the children most interested in? So that as we go through the galleries, we can say, now I hear you folks have been learning about it. And then we can ask them to tell us what they see in certain objects or certain paintings because of what they've already learned. It's very exciting, I think, for them to be able to explain things to the grown-ups and tell us how things are connected. So it's very nice. We can always try to tailor the lesson to the class that's in front of us, those kids and that teacher and what they've actually been doing. And that's, I think, a very rare thing.
Well, is there anything else that you really want people to know?
Maybe one more thing, since in the curriculum there's, even for social studies, it's very clear, or history in general, that we have to make a connection with the environment. So, and in this case, we can, because we look at resources that are available for people. We look at resources that, in the case of North America, that leads to talk about traditional knowledge among First Peoples. And eventually that knowledge is passed on to settlers, and why that knowledge is critical for settlers to survive in this land that they were not familiar with. There's the idea of how we use these resources and stewardship behind it. I mean, we were talking about using blubber for fueling this lamp. Well, eventually, there was a time when whale oil was the best oil out there. But we know that overfishing, over hunting of fish, it's a mammal, over hunting whales cause extinction. And so for that reason, we don't use whale oil anymore, and there's a reason behind that. Humans are looking for another source, right? And so we make these connections between how the environment is used, and to show that there's much more that's connected than we might imagine.
Right, or the olive oil for the Roman lamb. Well, that's really interesting because at the ROM we're lucky because we have world cultures and have natural history. So when we're talking about how the natural world is connected to the cultural world, we have researchers and collections that have to do with both. So the learning department and the teachers who are delivering these lessons have really current information that is reacting to research as it comes out. So that's a really easy way for us at the ROM to be able to tie those two elements together in the lessons. Well,
that's what we do.
That's it. So thank you so much for talking to us about this and the benefits of learning with objects and primary sources here at the museum, and giving some information about the new curriculum and how all of our courses are curriculum-based. So thanks for joining us for our first ever ROM Learning Google Hangout, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
In person.
That's right.